Presenting a timely webinar entitled Climate Effects on Communities of Color. It's sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. This panel is one of many in a series commemorating Black History Month. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. During today's program, we encourage that you ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A, not the chat function. And if you do not see the controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. We will address questions at the end of the panel. And we'll be sharing a recording of this program to everybody who is registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. And with that, we're thrilled to bring to you today's program entitled Climate Effects on Communities of Color. We have a great list of panelists. We have Lisa Benjamin, who is Assistant Professor of Law at Lewis and Clark School. We have Melissa Bryan. She is Barry University School of Law, class of 2021, and president of Barry Law Chapter for the Federal Bar Association. We also have Omega Wilson. He's the co-founder of West End Revitalization Association. And we also may have Charles Lee, who is a senior policy advisor for environmental justice at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And I'm Barrett Holmes-Pittner. I'm your moderator, and I am the founder and philosopher chief of the Sustainable Culture Lab. And I am also a lecturer at the George Washington University. But I think we can, I ran through that pretty quick. And so let's just jump straight into our panelists, make sure they have as much time as possible. So I'll kick it to Lisa, and Lisa, take it away.
Thank you very much, Barrett, and thank you to Nadia and Ali and everyone at the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. I'm so happy to be here with you today. So I am going to share my slides with you, and I am going to focus on climate effects on communities of color, specifically from the international perspective. And I'll also touch on some domestic US issues as well. So I really want to start by saying that this is a really broad issue. So climate change itself is not an environmental issue only, it is an economic issue. It has to do with histories of countries through colonialism and neocolonialism. There's obviously issues of race, discrimination, racial justice, and it's very economic. So the first time I went to climate negotiations, the head of my delegation from a small island state said, this is actually not an environmental negotiation, this is an economic negotiation. And he was absolutely right. And so when negotiating climate change, you have to take into account all of these histories of different countries and vulnerable subgroups within countries. And those vulnerable subgroups are often Black and Brown communities. So there are issues of land use planning, historic land use planning, and now we're seeing a lot of issues of migration and displacement as a result. And I think it's also very important to point out that these are systemic issues and they have to do with health. We're seeing a lot of health impacts as a result of climate change and climate-induced issues like air pollution. And of course, it's very political, and media images are really important. So I'll run through a couple of images and around sort of communities and climate change. So I usually, when I teach environmental justice or climate change, I start with colonialism. And just to point out that it wasn't just a sort of physical exploitation system, it was actually an economic system, and it was an extractive system, where natural resources were taken from global South countries, in addition to people forcibly taken, and territories within the United States taken. And those raw materials were the basis of the wealth that we see today in a lot of countries and a lot of populations within countries. So that wealth was not evenly distributed even within countries. So it was an economic system that obviously had tremendous levels of exploitation of people involved, but also it created a huge amount of wealth. And so it was an extraction and appropriation system that extracted people, natural resources, took land, and also culture. And so I have this picture here from the British Museum on the Elgin marbles are on the left, but the Benin statues are the statues of the royal family of Benin, which were in the British Museum and have been taken. And just up until a few years ago, were not repatriated. And so there are issues of culture, senses of place that are still live issues, particularly now when we have climate-induced displacement and migration. And so this is just a picture that I show that is just a physical representation of, ecological debts owed to global South countries. And these histories of colonialism and exploitation are still very sensitive issues within countries and also within the negotiations around climate change. And so if you go to the negotiations and you sit in the group of global South countries, which is the G77 in China group that the Bahamas, the country where I'm from, is part of, if you look around the room, it's all Black and brown people that are negotiating for their countries with negotiators from the global South, from the global North that traditionally did not want to make a lot of progress on climate change. It's not just a historic issue, and so neocolonialism continues today with new participants in the raw extractive materials system. And even within colonialism, there were corporate actors involved traditionally. And so, through, let's say, the British colonial system, the British East Africa country was a state-based company that was incorporated and, was basically a colonial system through a corporation. We also have that through companies in Canada, like the Hudson Bay Company. And so non-state actors, companies were a historic participant and are still a live participant, particularly through multinational companies in the extractive systems today. And so we're still seeing a ton of raw materials being extracted from global South countries and used to fuel consumption levels in the global North. And so people don't like to talk about the consumption part of climate change, but it is hugely consumption driven. And that consumption is subsidized in the global North by raw materials from the global South. And those raw materials, so the consumption levels in global North countries, cannot be sustained by the raw materials within those countries. And so those raw materials have to be extracted from somewhere else. That means the levels of consumption in wealthy countries, and these now include populations in wealthy, large developing countries as well. Those levels of consumption exceed the natural resources that are available in those countries. And we're now hitting ecological tipping points where biological diversity is, at crisis point, climate change is at a crisis point, because the economic systems that fuel that consumption do not include the negative environmental externalities of the consumption. And, greenhouse gas emissions are the primary externality of consumption. And unfortunately, the equity bind means that the impacts of climate change are going to be felt largely in the global South. And many of those countries, including small island states, do not contribute a lot to the emissions. And so not a lot has changed. So the consumption of things like energy, metals, paper, a large percentages of it are actually used from developed countries. So that's the vast majority of raw materials in the world. And these high levels of consumption are fueling the environmental crises that we see, the biological diversity crisis and the climate crisis. And so this is just a graph that looks at global inequality and living conditions through the very high rates and the very low rates. And so you can see at the bottom, it's a little faint, but you can see that, for example, expected years of schooling in Australia, it's 22, almost 23 years. And in South Sudan, it's 4 years, 4.9 years. And that's not that far. 1 year was a global average from 1800. And so you can see that levels of development in some least developed countries in particular have not improved at the level that they should have. And that's because global inequality is getting worse. It's not getting better. And so we are seeing really high rates of poverty in a lot of global South countries and a tremendous amount of global inequality. So the top 1% around the world, and this is in both global North and global South countries, are capturing a huge amount of global growth around the world. And so these rates of inequality are actually not only fueling high levels of consumption, but they're also preventing vulnerable communities in countries from being able to be climate resilient. And so being able to adapt. So access to healthcare, access to infrastructure, access to wealth, these are really primary indicators of whether or not you can adapt to climate change. And the levels of global inequality are really preventing that. I want to talk just really briefly about the temperature goals. So the Paris Agreement has a global temperature goal to keep increases in mean global temperatures well below 2 degrees. And vulnerable countries fought very hard to include a reference, an aspirational goal to keep that increase to 1.5. And there's actually a huge difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have told us. And so if we blow past the 1.5 degree temperature limit, in fact, the worst impacts of the difference between 1.5 and 2 are going to be felt in the global south. So 1.5 is bad, but it's not as bad as 2. And so we know that developing countries are going to feel the brunt of this, and they're also going to suffer from the difference between 1.5 and 2. So there's a huge push to keep global temperature limits to 1.5. So the vulnerable subgroups within vulnerable countries are the ones, and within wealthy countries are the ones that are going to feel it the most. And so disadvantaged and vulnerable populations within small and developing states, indigenous communities, coastal communities, communities that are reliant on fisheries and agriculture for subsistence, they're the ones who are going to feel the brunt of these impacts, and they already are feeling them. And that goes for communities within the United States as well. And so once you have sort of one level of risk, these risks compound over time. And so once you're disadvantaged, you can't adapt, you experience a climate-induced disaster, let's say, you're even more disadvantaged, you have less ability to adapt. And so it's a vicious cycle that continues. So this is an image that I took from Hurricane Dorian, which hit my country, the Bahamas, in September 2019. I have very mixed feelings about this image because I really, sort of hurts me to see Black and Brown communities in distress, particularly people from my country. But this really picture tells 1,000 words of what happens in these disasters. Everything is gone. Everything is gone. Like her house is gone, her community is gone. It's just devastated. And people were literally washed out of their homes because the sea levels were so high, and those people have not been found. So they just drowned at sea, and we had to bury people in empty coffins. So not only the physical and the economic disasters are devastating, but the emotional and cultural toll that it takes, and psychological, is immense. And so small in the States, communities in Louisiana, communities in Texas now are really suffering these disasters, and they're climate induced. And the difference between 1.5 and 2 is tremendous. And so we can see that poverty and disadvantage actually increase and compound as a result of climate change. And so disadvantaged groups actually get more vulnerable, and they get poorer over time. And so that's the vicious cycle of climate change. This is a blog that I wrote about a UN Special Rapporteur report on extreme poverty and climate change. And this UN Special Rapporteur actually called the impacts of climate change on poor and vulnerable communities a climate apartheid. And that is what we're heading. And that racialized language was used specifically because it is Black and Brown communities that are predominantly bearing the brunt of climate change and are not able to get out of the cycle that they are in. And so, the numbers are staggering. So a 1.5 increase is going to expose about 450 million people, more people, to climate-related risks. And a 2 degrees increase would add an additional 100 to 400 million people at risk of hunger, 1 to 2 billion for lack of fresh water, and migration levels of over 100 million people, specifically in areas of the global south. A lot of that displacement may be internal, but some of it for very small countries may have to be international displacement. So poor, vulnerable communities are not bearing the brunt of climate change, but they are only responsible for about 10% of global emissions. And so it is sort of wealthy and wealth inequality, the top 1%, which on this scale is about most middle class citizens in developed countries, are responsible for multiple more emissions than people in the bottom 10% economically. And so this really is a problem of economic inequality, consumption, and sort of disadvantage that's been going on for a long time. And so this is just a headline of this. So the world's richest populations, 1%, cause twice the levels of emissions as the poorest 50% of the global population. So it makes me really angry when people talk about there's too many people in the world. That's not right in terms of climate change. It's levels of consumption of wealthy people that has fueled the climate crisis. And that is a problem that I don't think people talk about. And that level of wealth and consumption is racialized. And so there are studies that have been done that have actually looked at the racial population of consumption and air pollution. And so because, white populations are, on average wealthier, they are leading to and causing a lot more air pollution. And because of where plants are situated, for example, and where highways are situated, that leads to more exposure for Black and Brown communities. And so this level of wealth and emissions and harm is definitely racialized. And this is a recent study that came out about air pollution. And so we actually know that the heat of climate change pushes what they call TRAP, so traffic related air pollution, closer to the ground. The closer it is to the ground, the more people are breathing it in and children are breathing it in. And we know historically in the United States that highways have been sited either very near Black and Brown communities or actually through them, dividing the community. And so Black women are most at risk for particulate matter that harms them and particularly if they're pregnant, harms their children. And so percentage wise, they have more still term births, they have more early births, low birth weights. And so these are literally intergenerational harms that we are passing on as a result of emissions, which is now compounded by climate change. So these are affecting future generations of these communities. So this is a blog that was written by two friends of mine who are climate negotiators, and they made this connection between Black Lives Matter and climate change. And so I think this racialized element of climate change is not discussed, but you can see it in the negotiations. And obviously you can see it now in the impacts that disproportionate pollution and harm have caused on disadvantaged communities in the United States and around the world. And so this, the movement of the Black Lives Matter has really raised this issue. And, it's really, we see it in COVID-19 as well. So we see the impacts of air pollution and disproportionate impacts of Black and Brown communities who are dying of COVID-19. And so this has really, savaged the Latinx community. It has had, tremendous impacts on Native American communities, and compounded by the fact that there's a lack of access to water, for example, on Native reservations. And so these are some similarities that I often talk about between COVID-19, racism, and climate change. These are structural issues. They're very much related to structural socioeconomic disadvantage and inequality, and also lack of resilience. So the inability to access healthcare, good healthcare services, the inability to actually have resilience and bounce back. And then of course, if you have underlying health conditions to begin with, because of where you live, then you're going to be much more vulnerable to COVID-19. And in particular, climate impacts in COVID-19 are what we call nonlinear. So the impacts happen really quickly. So overnight, you can have, massive changes. And that's the problem with climate change, is we could hit tipping points where overnight we have, these events that are irreversible. And of course, they are having and have had the most impact on the most vulnerable populations in the world. And so we saw this with COVID-19. A lot of leaders in the environmental justice community in the United States were talking about air pollution and why, Black and Brown communities were actually disadvantaged anyway. And so if you look on the left, these are the impacts of health facilities that are cited, near and within Black and Brown communities. So lung diseases, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, these are impacts of pollution. And those are almost exactly some of the underlying health conditions that make people more vulnerable to death because of COVID-19. And so there is a direct link between air pollution and climate-induced exacerbating air pollution and the impacts of COVID-19. So environmental justice is racial justice, climate justice is racial justice, and I think that link is really important to make. In sort of a hopeful note, it's really, really encouraging to see. I always love teaching my students about climate change because they just have, different generations have a different perspective on climate change than my generation has and had. And so in fact, there are linkages between the climate strikes that we saw a couple of years ago and, young people learning from those climate strikes and using those protest techniques in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think that's really important that these movements are linked. And I also want to end on some sort of image issues. So I don't know if you all remember this, but this was a couple of years ago at Davos, I think. A reporter from Reuters used a photo at the top, and there was a young climate activist, I think she's from Uganda, Vanessa, who was cropped out of the picture. And so then she tweeted and said, why was I not in the picture? And Reuters sort of said, oh, we made a mistake and included her. And so at all levels of climate change, not just the impacts, but at the activist level, at the negotiator level that I can attest to, at the Black climate scientist level, there are levels of racism baked into the system that make it harder for us to do our job. And so this is a great story. I think this is in the Washington Post by a Black climate scientist who was like, you know, this is just emotionally exhausting to battle racism and try to manage the issue of climate change, which in and of itself is really difficult. So I want to end with a couple of images. So Black and brown people have been involved in the environmental justice struggle around the world for a very long time. So this is young people involved in the protests around PCB siting in their neighborhood. And I think these images are really important for positive images of our communities that are actually taking action. And so this is an NGO from Fiji that's female-led, that's very inclusive in terms of LGBTQ communities that are creating solutions to make their country a better place. This is a great NGO called No White Saviors. These are a group of women who are work in development work and are really focused on community-led activism in their community. And so they really want to make sure that Black and brown stories are at the front of their work in Uganda. And then this is the Swiss Grannies. So we have lots of different communities involved. So the Swiss Grannies sued for climate justice in Switzerland because of the disproportionate impacts on them. This is a great NGO for Pacific Islanders that's very inclusive and so want to bring sort of queer and transgender Asian and Pacific Islanders to take action on environmental justice. And advocacy can work. So this is a story in Portland where I am, where there was a highway expansion of a highway. And you know, if I think through the Black Lives Matter protests, the city said, actually, we should not expand this highway, which goes through a historic Black neighborhood in Albina. And so protest movements can work and they can be helpful. And I just want to add a note at the very end on the executive order on the climate crisis. It has a really interesting section on international finance, which is really important for climate change. That finance went away in the previous administration under the Paris Agreement. So, you know, we are hopeful for the future. So thank you very much.
That was great. I think one of the, especially in the US, we talk about stuff almost like in a very ahistorical way, I feel, where like we're just kind of trying to extinguish this fire over here or that thing, and we don't take the time to step back and look at like what's happening now is due to like theories and ideas that have been existing for hundreds of years. And, you know, you could very well say people had no concept of the ramifications of what these destructive actions would be. And now we have to like refocus and have a different perspective to tackle these problems. So seeing this narrative from the extractive nature of the transatlantic slave trade and how that foundation is impacting climate change and racial inequality and, you know, and the environmental justice movement was really, really that broad picture, I think, was a perfect way to start this conversation today. So Lisa, thank you very much for that. And now I guess we'll kick it to the next person. So Mega, you ready? All right.
Yeah, I'm ready. Are my slides up?
Perfect. Let's see. There we go.
Okay. Well, it's great to be here today to bring what Lisa talked about to the ground level in the history all the way back to indigenous landowners in Alamance County, Occoneechee-Saponi. So the title of my presentation is Ground Level Ground Truthing, Climate Impact Causes in Mebane, North Carolina. And next slide. Now, there are a whole list of things that we're dealing with here. And the map on the right is a map that we did, and it's on our website all the way back in 2000, dealing with all the kind of the disparities, highway corridors, and other kind of things crisscrossing the communities, the gray areas, or the African American and Native American communities. And the little boxes on the side, of course, you can't read them here, indicate that these communities don't have safe drinking water, but they're massive production, great golf courses and everything near them that have safe drinking water, streets paved, but the communities do not have that. We have legacy factories all the way back to the time of the 1800s after the Civil War and into slavery, and mills that slaves worked in. Some of those factories and some of the pollutants are still there. And some people don't connect this directly to what's happening in the air. But when you start ripping the land apart, you readmit the pollutants that were put in the ground during slavery time to build new facilities. It all comes back out of the ground again. We have a 119 bypass overpass through our community that was planned for 16 years without community input, all the way from Mebane, North Carolina to Danville, Virginia, 27 miles long. We have mega distribution facilities that have been built right next to legacy facilities that were built 100 years ago. Pollution on top of pollution in our neighborhoods. We have a planned Mountain Valley pipeline, major pipeline from Virginia to North Carolina through Alamance County where we have zoning the living and the dead out of existence by local and state government agencies with using our tax dollars. And right now there's a 20-year construction plan with little regard to civil rights, environmental protection, climate justice, or the consequences of climate. Thank you. Next slide. Now, back here a couple of years ago, in November of 2019, we had a dinner to raise the question of if people weren't concerned about what was going on, would they be concerned if we directed the danger to churches? And we identified over 24 churches specifically that would be impacted by the planned pipeline, MVP as they call it, and the highway corridor, the 119 bypass. And there were dozens of churches, and those were mostly African American, indigenous, and some white churches also. And we created a logo, slogan is, we have to build a floor, a foundation so we can start fighting it. And for spiritual and religious people at our dinner, we shared it in a way that hopefully they understood. You build it on faith, you build it on love, you build it on optimism, you build it on overcoming, but you have to have a response. You have to have a result. Next slide. Now, who's responsible for all of this pain and suffering? The who, what, when, where, and why. Who is responsible for challenging the threat? The pastors, the congregants, the residents, the tax-paid city, county, state, federal, appointed, and elected officials. What is the risk? The risk to pregnancy, to children, to seniors, the sick, and the healthy. Where is the risk? It's in our homes, our churches, our cemeteries, our playground, our businesses. And what was the catalyst to build a floor? What was the catalyst that created the foundation? We wanted to change the pain. And this pain involves climate, racial disparities that has been going on for centuries. We had human waste in our drinking water. We had sewage in ditches and streams, unpaved streets, landfills next door, homes and churches and cemeteries threatened. But the blind eye in the pulpit did nothing. Pastors, in most cases, did nothing out of fear. Racial discrimination by tax-paid public officials and university scientists who researched our death, dying, and suffering, but did nothing. We had to overcome the fear in order to get right to basic amenities. All the things that Lisa talked about and Barrett referenced again are our rights as human beings and our rights as citizens and taxpayers. Next slide. Those things that are impacted, of course, directly relate to air quality, safe drinking water. Some people refer to clean water, but legally clean water in the United States is water on the ground. You don't drink it. You drink safe drinking water. I hear that mistake over and over and over again by lawyers, public presenters, commentators on TV. But safe drinking water is not the same as clean water. This particular church is a church that was built by my ancestors out of slavery. This is not the original structure in 1893. It was targeted for elimination along with 70 some houses in the community, including right where I'm sitting, with secret meetings that was held for 16 years by local and federal government officials to eliminate it, to build this highway corridor. What does this have to do with climate? This highway corridor will bring thousands of rolling stock tractor trailer trucks, vehicle emissions. It would create a large number of factories and clear cutting of forests. All of these things directly contribute to the environment and climate at the local level where people live. And this change locally affects people in the Virgin Islands. It affects people in other parts of the country. It affects people in South America. These changes here are massive, and we're going to bring you to that in a short moment. Next slide. Now, the church we saw earlier is the same church being torn down in 2016. It was being torn down as we identified it, fecal coliform and E. coli in drinking water of dozens of homes of African American communities that surround the city of Mebane, where they were put after slavery ended. And they were never allowed to connect to the sewer system, even though the sewer system was built in 1920. Some of the ones were connected 80 years after the sewer system was built, even though they were the closest ones to it within a block or two. All their lives smelling sewage from other communities, but could not connect themselves. And the church that many of them went to, including my family, was torn down to make way for a massive highway. Next slide. The highway negotiated with the senior members of the church a few years ago and built a much smaller church right beside the highway corridor, 600 feet from the one they tore down. It's absolutely ridiculous. To create that same disparity all over again with a brand new property, and the church was built at 1/3 of its estimated real estate value. That's criminal, and that's persecuting the same people who've been persecuted all over again. Next slide. This is another church in our same community. This church is right across the street from where I'm sitting. It's only less than a block. It was founded in 1865 by descendants from slaves mixed with the slave master. The cemetery is right beside it. The deacon is kneeling on the ground right next to, his name is Donald Tate, kneeling on the ground right next to Dean Valerie Johnson, who's a preservationist from the state of North Carolina. And she's also one of the few Blacks who's doing this in the state. And she's now the dean at Arts and Sciences, Humanities at Shaw University, where my wife and I graduated from. The plan was to eliminate this church. This is the new building. It was built a few decades ago. The original was a very small frame building it was built in 1865. They wanted to plow up the cemetery where people were buried decades into slavery. This is the place where they buried slaves. People are still being buried there now. People are being buried there in vessels that are cremated as a result of COVID-19 because you can't have regular funerals anymore. This particular site in this church and its founding pastor, was a relative descendant of two governors, W. Kerr Scott, Robert Scott, and Ralph Scott, who were two governors and a senator for the state of North Carolina. So it's so much obvious that with extreme privilege becomes extreme poverty and extreme oppression, and they're not even a degree away. They're the same bloodline. Next slide. The indigenous community had been very quiet in our community, in our county for a long time, the Occaneechi-Saponi. But in 2019, the same year we did this dinner, they were part of that dinner. This is a celebration where they said we're gonna make Columbus Day Indigenous Peoples Day. And this is a celebration to bring their recognition, and they're working with African-American, white Americans, and other people in the community to start addressing it openly and publicly. Next slide. This is one of the areas of massive growth and development. It's a mega distribution park, mega industrial park that's being built on the Scott property, descendants of the Scott property that is sold. As you see, the yellow area is Walmart. The green area is Lidl, and other developments are coming. It's thousands of acres, 7 miles long. People say, well, what does this have to do with climate? We all know factories are emitters. We all know thousands of trucks and vehicles who come in here on a daily basis, 24/7, are emitters. The plan for this mega industrial park, which is thousands of acres, is identified as one of the largest in the east coast of North Carolina, and the east coast of the United States, and it is in central North Carolina. This is what they refer to as a dryland port area, and it will be built out for 20 some years with dozens and dozens of the largest facilities in the world being brought here. And they're sacrificing the Black and brown communities in order to make way for them. Next slide. This is the groundbreaking. Something interesting about the groundbreaking photo for Lidl, $125 million plant, right? These decisions are predominantly white men, a lot of old white men. If you look at the picture to the very right, there's one white woman. And to the left, near the sign, there's one white woman. And there are no people of color in this. So the people who are making these decisions, who are creating this burden, are still old white men. Something has to change in the decision making for this, and it's happening over and over again. There's groundbreaking now for a $265 million UPS right beside this location. I grew up in this location, walked on this ground where my father worked the farmland. Next slide. Also planned in Alamance County is the Mountain Valley, not Mississippi, Mountain Valley Pipeline. It was pushed back once and they're coming back again. There's another pipeline in the coastal area. This will go through indigenous property all the way from Virginia through Alamance County, right near where I'm sitting. It will become a part of the corridor of emitting properties. It creates imminent danger to water, streams, wetlands, aquifers, etc. And the abuse of property, the abuse of homes, abuse of farmland, the abuse of churches, the abuse of burial grounds is all of what is put at risk. It has been done in other states, and it's a plan to do it on the coast of North Carolina and also in the central part of North Carolina. All of these create an issue at the ground level of what causes climate change, and a lot of younger people think about it in the disposition of what is in the air. A lot of people do not know what it looks like at the ground level. They don't see it at the ground level. They don't actually see it happening. They only see it in pie charts, graphs, public articles, and blogs. people need to understand it's a direct impact where people live. Next slide. This is the Walmart, the largest in the United States. In the background is farmland. I grew up on this farm. My father worked this farm with one arm. He was an amputee. He lost his arm in a mill accident when he was 21 years old. So he worked this farm. This is a Kimmery farm. They sold part of that land to build the largest Walmart distribution facility in the United States. This is part of the mega development that is taking place. This is already built. Lidl, that I mentioned earlier, is already built. Next slide. Now, this is a compilation of showing what it looks like when all these things are right next to a Black and brown community that's been here into slavery and now out of slavery and now in 2021. We have the 119 bypass corridor that's in red in the middle is being built. You have Cambro Plastics, a $100 million facility that ships plastic materials to 5 different continents. Plastics, of course, the manufacture of it is an emitter. The burning, the destroying of it after you use it is an emitter. Right next to that, to the left, is a massive junkyard. It's been there for probably since cars were being made, dumping all kinds of chemicals in the ground, and there's a river next by. At the top is Craft Teak, a 100-year-old furniture plant. Drilled down in the ground, you find chemicals that are all the way down to the aquifer level that's cancer causing. Then right in the middle, farm chemical manufacturing concern. Then the Western community is trying to survive where I live. I'm in that community right there that you're looking at. And then the railroad corridor and the highway comes right through it. All of these things on top of one community, and they're building more and more and more and more. All of these are emitters, all in the same location. Next slide. This is a ground level look at it. We had to file a complaint in 2000, an interagency complaint with the Department of Justice, EPA, and the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality to identify this site as a Superfund site. They refused. They refused. This 30-acre site that's been here 100-some years, dumping chemicals on the ground forever, right? All the way back in the 30s. They said if we identify it as a Superfund site, we have to stop the highway from being built. We filed another complaint to get them to clean up the site before the construction started. And our complaint resulted in the removal of over 5,000 pounds of liquid toxins and waste that was unsecured, that was open to anybody to come and get it. So we don't really even know if that was all of it or not, right? Benzene, xylenes, and other kinds of chemicals that were tracked all the way 20 to 45 feet below surface level down to the aquifer. And this was documented by the Department of Environmental Quality. And it was only done because we demanded it be done. The federal government, the local government, state government actually did no oversight. We had to push and push and push to get this done. Pay close attention to the water tower you keep seeing. The yellow area there to your right, you'll see where the St. Luke Church used to be, right? It was destroyed as a part of this construction. Next slide. This is a little later. The 1 mile overpass is one of the longest overpasses in the state of North Carolina. We have over 10 million people here. This state is 500 miles long from coast to mountains, right? And this is through the Western community. This is through the community that got rid of houses. We diverted the path of it and saved over 70 residential locations and a couple of churches, but we still lost a lot of them. And the environmental impact statement that EPA was supposed to do to save us and mitigate it didn't happen. Next slide. I participated with EPA with a project called a Guzman recommendation, and I had to file a complaint to have our comments included in the formal document. And I wrote the section 3.1 effective community engagement and 3.1a Community facilitated strategy, because only the scientists and professors wanted to talk about us in abstract. They sat in the same meetings with us and did not want our input included. These are major respected college and university professors and researchers. They only wanted in the document what they wanted in the document. So we had to file a complaint with the EPA administrator at the time, Lisa Perez Jackson, who now works for Apple, right? And this document was entitled Reducing Air Emissions Associated with Goods Movement, Air Quality, Land, Marine, Rail, which is what I mentioned, in November of 2009. This was a part of the report that was submitted to Council for Environmental Quality that sits at the elbow of the president. That agency was doing very little and is being restructured right now under President Biden and Harris. We're still looking for justice. Next slide. This is my wife, who's participated in a effective community engagement activity with the city of Mebane. We're mapping our community, because there's several of them, because the city refused to map them. And we put them on our website 22 years ago. Now they're using our maps to create the digital maps at the expense of the city rather than out of our pockets, our retirement funds. So everybody can see where our communities are. And as the city grows and continues to grow and develop, we know where they are, and we address these environmental impacts and disparities, civil, legal, environmental, social, et cetera, based on what the map shows us. Next slide. These are other people in it. My wife's name is Brenda, by the way. This is the mayor doing the mapping session with the retired court clerk, who is one of the community residents, impacted community resident, Neil Farrington. And the lady with her back to us is a 30-year healthcare professional, Yvonne Connolly, our board chair. The next slide, or two city officials who's the planners in the planning department, and a city council person, and another impacted resident. Next slide. Here is the city manager. Our son is in the picture closest to us. He's an attorney, Omori Wilson. And on the right are two Jasons. Jason Gaskin is a pastor who is trying to integrate churches in Mebane, because all of them are either Black or white or indigenous. They're not integrated. That's a part of his state mission, is authorized by the United Methodist Church. Right next to him is Jason Keck. He's indigenous. He and his wife are living in the Occoneechee-Saponi area in the north part of Mebane. We could set up the structural way to get community facilitated strategy. Since the city wouldn't call these meetings, we called them, we structured it, and they decided to cooperate. Next slide. We're just looking for climate justice for Black, Indigenous, and Latino communities in Mebane, North Carolina. And we just want to know where it is. Even though we're in the planning process, we're not there yet. And the way to get it done is engagement. And sometimes the engagement has to be created not by universities, not by lawyers, it be demanded legally by the impacted communities where we live. And we're doing that on a local level, a state level, and a national level. Thank you so much for giving us the time and the platform.
No, that was wonderful, Omega. And I'll say I'm from the South. I'm from Atlanta. I don't have an accent, but my mom is from Charleston, South Carolina, and my dad's from Prattville, Alabama. And I remember I can't remember the year, but it hit me at one point that the whole infrastructure of the South is based around this type of division. And there is a narrative that people act as though it's organic, that it's not systematic and based on policies to make sure that the Black communities in the South get exploited and they get destroyed for the financial gain of white infrastructure, whether that's like the benefit of Atlanta or the whole or Walmart or whatever. Like, this is just how it's always been structured. And the more you go back and back in the history, you see that this is happening at the whole time. And so I think it's really important when we're talking about environmental justice and racism and everything that's impacting and keeping America's division, that people see this perspective where like this type of division that a lot of people are going to be comfortable thinking hasn't always existed, or this is a newer development, but like this is a systemic problem that hits people generation to generation. You can see it really easily. We just like look at one person's family where like you can talk about your family's experience, and like this land right here is the land that like used to be a plantation and slaves used to work on there. That cemetery that has people that are dying now is also the same cemetery that slaves are buried, and that land and and that church, all of that has been forced to be moved or destroyed. And for some reason throughout time, whether it's an interstate highway or just any sort of, it's not safe to drink the water there because they've been dumping the pollutants in that area. And so I just think it's really, really important for people to understand the systemic structural nature of this and how it's always been the same. The other day I was doing some research on Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and the foundation of that church was the Black congregants were worshiping alongside, not alongside, but they were sharing, like how it used to be where there'd be like a white church and on the Black community would worship in the basement, or they'd have like a day where they could worship where the white people weren't there. At some point, the white community decided to build a garage for their hearse on a Black cemetery. And that's when the Black community said, we can't worship alongside you. Like, we have to make our own church. And so then they got onto the AME movement that was really popular in the North, and they brought it to the South. But like, when we're talking about your church example, and it just really made me think about that, where like I've told people that these white Charlestonians are like, we're going to build a garage for a hearse on a Black cemetery. And everyone was like, that's outrageous. I don't think that, people were really skeptical, but no, that's just systemically how our society has been structured in the South and in large parts of the US. And there's clear components of that impact climate and everything. And so anyways, I think so far this has gone really well. We have a very big global perspective. We've gotten really, really local. And now we're going to kick it to Melissa, who's in Jamaica right now. So she's having a good time. The weather is probably really, really good, I assume. So Melissa, here you go.
Hello, thank you everyone. I'm Melissa Bryan and I'm from former Jamaica, and I just want to thank ABA Civil Rights Division for the opportunity to be here today as a law student to advocate. So I'm currently co-authoring a paper with Professor Ahmad by the name of Environmental Law and Segregation. And based on my research, one can say for a fact that environmental racism and residential segregation are inseparable, both resulting from systemic racism, where there's a connection with non-white communities with low poverty values, poor school quality, white-dominated political system, gentrification, exclusionary zoning, and also definitely redlining of the environmental. So I want to talk about wealth maximization. Environmental law, climate change, the carceral state, the disposition of land, pollution, chemical toxicity are all inextricably related. The environmentalism of white spaces, of suburbs and rural areas is meant to limit and restrict access to environmental rights and segregate communities. More so, environmentalism and climate change adaptation have been exclusively the domain of protecting white spaces. Even green growth initiatives and renewable energy development occurs on the Blacks of indigenous poor, Black and brown folks basically interrelate. So when we talk about protecting and preserving pristine white lands or white spaces, as we typically refer them to, the term white spaces, as we use it as in a basically scholarly, that's how we use it, white spaces. So white spaces meaning protecting white land, protecting white spaces from people who are Black and brown. And as a result, it is important to know where climate changes is concerned. Climate changes is basically, which I'll refer to more further in my speaking. I would say that a lot of immigrants are climate refugees. So a lot of immigrants come to the US seeking a pristine space where they can provide for their family and eventually develop. Climate cages refer to the facilities that host kids who have been separated with their families at the border. A warming planet has decreased available land, fresh water, and clean air available to live and earn a livelihood in their country. So many people try to seek refuge in the US. The government's response from House of Congress, the desk of the Oval Office, has been struggling clearly to find solutions to help in this global climate crisis. But one of the things that we realized that they've been doing, they've been restricting mobility and incarcerating Black and brown people to maximize available land and space for those who are either more affluent or more preferred, as we call them white spaces, in terms of race, religion, and national origin. While historically human hierarchies can think of caste system, classism, racism, those things have been established for years. I've seen it in my country where we mostly have classism, but it's evident all over the world. So basically the impacts of global warming has intensified and have correlated with prisons and now climate, which is very weird. So in the US, there's now being seen where climate cages is now technically being reopened. And I've read an article recently where they're thinking about opening a second facility in Florida to basically help housing most of the kids who need more spaces based on where they are hosted now. Um, Especially now with COVID-19 and the need for space to facilitate these kids. But to be honest, it's still a lot because you have between 15 to 700 kids living in facilities that probably only host 1 to 200. And with COVID-19 protocols trying to be put in place, it's very hard to host all those kids in one places. So that's basically a bit of a summary of climate cage. Moving on, I wanted to give a bit of a backstory of how climate gentrification occur in a third world country. Like for example, I'm in Jamaica right now, and it's seen that richer people live in the mountains while poorer people live towards the coastal line, and thus right now they're more being affected by climate changes. My hometown in Portmore, Jamaica, we have a beach called Elshire, which is being significantly impacted by beach erosion. And as a result, those people who have lived across the beachland for so many years are now having to move inland. And so, but moving inland, meaning moving into spaces where there are more white, more wealthier people already living in those lands. And so living in those lands is very expensive. So their experiences a lot of challenges because of displacement of beach erosion and coastline. Now, I'm gonna do a comparison. Here in the US, there is Little Haiti in Miami, Florida. Hopefully most people have heard about that historical area. As a Caribbean national, I found it very interesting of what was happening to the colored and immigrant population in Miami. So Florida, as a result of climate gentrification, you have those people who have been living in Little Haiti for over 30 plus years. They've moved and now they've lived there for over 30 plus years, and now they have to move due to the increase in rent. And basically, most of those people that live there pay rent. And so now the rents are increasing because wealthier people want to take over their land so that they can move there, which is basically what climate gentrification is about. So there's water rising on the coastal communities, which are typically for richer, or as you could say, white space. And those people are now moving inland and taking away certain housing units from the current colored people to build luxury homes. So they claim that they're taking those land to build luxury homes, to revitalize and in an inclusive way to the community. But to think about it, is that really real? You're revitalizing it by taking away other people's land to make it better, but that's just what they say it is. But no, it isn't. It is really developers looking for communities on elevated land to build their luxury condos, basically out of the rubble of public housing developments and the replacement of community-run businesses with high-end commercial real estate development. That's what it is. So here's areas with high elevation like the neighborhood Little Haiti are now being extremely impacted by climate gentrification because of the developers now increasing their rent, causing their cost of living to be extremely high. Like, for example, I watched a documentary in about Little Haiti, and they were saying that their rent increased from $245 to $500 to $735 within the space of a year. So that's like a 47% increase. That's crazy. Clearly, the people aren't going to be able to afford it, and yeah, clearly have to move out. And then that's when the developers would come in and take in their land. So basically, communities in existence for 40 plus years are now being displaced, and 10% of them possibly could stay, but I'm pretty sure 90% of them would have to move out. So the first wave of immigrants who started Little Haiti have now had to move out to places with lower elevation that has cheaper rent. I'm pretty sure that those places with cheaper rent aren't good where the environment is concerned. So there are numerous of different recommendations and policies being promoted to assist climate gentrification, but policies to promote climate gentrification is really not cheap. Yes, there are some cities that are trying to do things like, for example, Miami is urgently facing the repercussion of climate change, as I've given an example about Little Haiti. And so Miami has taken the first steps among its peers to keep natural disaster prone neighborhoods safe. And so they've recently agreed to use its income from the Miami, I think it's called Miami Forever Bond, to support flood-proofing infrastructure like water pumping station and better drainage, and to make the homes more resilient. However, more still needs to be done on a national and global level. One must remember to implement environmental policies are not cheap. So tax consideration has to come in place, but I think the best persons to pocket those expenses are the wealthier people and not necessarily the colored population who simply cannot afford it. Which, and I have to say why racial supremacy is evident. So one would recommend for us to find ways to enable those people of color to maintain a way to stay in the areas and develop those areas instead of raising the rent and then having them to move out of the areas that are more prone to climate risk. It is unfair as they live in areas that weren't as vulnerable to climate change, and now they have to move into areas that are now being vulnerable to climate change. As a law student, my goal is to help develop policies for colored people to not suffer from climate change. The wealthier people have access to funding needed to improve the buildings or relocate to other areas. So instead of driving out people out of their home that they have lived and built for years, then ironically, one can say that if people cannot get money as reparations, then investing in the Black and brown communities could be done as then investing in the communities of colors could be simply done as environmental reparations. So that's pretty much my presentation for today. All I literally want to say is climate gentrification is real. It's really that straightforward. Rectify the damage done or give the people opportunities or resources to do it themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Melissa. And I think one of the key things for when you look at all these presentations together, like gentrification in many ways is just a new word for something that's been happening for a very long time. And I think this speaks to how we view stuff in a like I said, a very ahistorical way, where we focus on the present, but like the process of colonizers or white dominated groups going into spaces of color, coming up with the language to justify the taking of that land as an improvement of the lives of everybody, and that society is better by displacing a large swath of people. Like, as you know, Americans and people in the global north now, we've grown up indoctrinated with that language that justifies this extraction, this forced removal, these problems. And now, as people of color that have more agency in our society than we've had in, you know, especially in the US in a very long time, the onus is on us to change the narrative so that this discourse where we're saying gentrification and not connecting it to what's happening to Omega's community, and not connecting it to like the wealth of research that Lisa's talking about that shows how it's from the transatlantic slave trade to today. It's really important that we make sure that this voice is out there and that we're saying this so people can see that this is just a continuation of a destructive consumption-based philosophy that colonizers have disseminated around the world. And now we've always been suffering the repercussions. And so it's just, I think this put everything together really, really nicely. And before we get into Q&As, because I think that's where we're at right now, I'd like to just give a quick little bit on my work, because it connects with everybody here too. I'm a philosopher, and I focus on this word ethnocide, which is the destruction of culture while keeping the people. And I use it to the transatlantic slave trade, where the goal of that was to get African people and destroy African culture, but keep their bodies, so that the foundation of a chattel slavery system in the Americas could get formed. And this connects to climate. And I'm really excited when I get to talk about this to climate, because the land that African people were forced to work on is the land that colonizers forced to remove indigenous people from. And then when we lived on that land, we weren't supposed to get any benefit of that. So there's already been a division of how the land was used, and that, you know, all of the waste is going to go to the area where African Americans, the people who are the victims of ethnocide, are going to live. And this structure has been how it's been since the very beginning. And we've always suffered from this. And there's always been a foundational of division and neglect, and not efficiently using the land in the US through via colonization. And the more we are aware of that, the more we can hopefully come up with the proper solutions to combat it. And so I'm just really glad I enjoyed the panel. I'm glad I could host it. And so at this point, let's look at some questions. I have a couple right off the bat, but let's see if the audience has anything. But okay, I'm just gonna jump in. So Omega, I want to kick it to you and see, like, you focus a lot on your community in North Carolina. Have you done like additional research on like similar communities in other states throughout the South? That have you guys created like a larger alliance with different groups to try to spread? I'm curious to see how much this has grown, or what the larger vision is with this, because it's really vital work.
Well, in 1999, we filed a complaint with the United States Department of Justice for violations of Title VI and environmental justice, the executive order. And that created a relatively firm platform, because we were not getting any responses from EPA. We're not getting responses from local government officials, nor state legislative officials, because we took van loads of residents to the state legislature. And we wound up on the front page of the Raleigh News and Observer in the fall of 2000. And a lot of people that we didn't know from different places decided to contact us about what we were doing. As a result of that, we were appointed to travel with NEJAC with Charles Lee. Charles Lee, by the way, came to North Carolina specifically to ask me to serve on NEJAC, to tell the story, to encourage other people to use the law to leverage, because he knew as a career EPA official that EPA wasn't strong enough to address it. And we filed our complaint with the Department of Justice. As a result of that, we wound up in front of people in Toronto, Canada, First Nations in Vancouver, Canada, in San Francisco, and Los Angeles and Houston and Delaware, New York, Florida. And we have a very special relationship with some communities in South Carolina and North Charleston. We're still working with them. We're still working with some residents in Washington, in the Washington, D.C., Maryland, New York area, including with WEAC. I think a lot of people know who WEAC is, with Peggy Shepard. And we also have communication with some other tribal communities and tribal representatives who are dealing with similar situations in among the Lakotas and the Apaches in Arizona and the Dakotas and other parts of the country. So as a result of our doing the work and having many lectures like this at law schools like Yale, North Carolina Central University Law School, which is indigenous, and numerous times at Duke University's law school. And I think some of those people are listening or tuning in today from those law schools. So the story that we have shared has been shared with a lot of communities of various ethnic backgrounds, including people outside the country. I'll finish this by saying that we were asked to be a part of a national international citizen science conference that was held in Raleigh in March of 2019, 2 years ago. And my wife and I were asked to help integrate this very large organization with thousands of members who are mostly high-end academic white people. The conference wound up being with over 800 participants. We had the largest activity, which was an environmental justice dinner, which is on YouTube, by the way. And we invited, my wife and I and Dr. Shakobi Wilson invited other people of color, and they were funded with a scholarship from the National Science Foundation. 800 people, all 50 states represented, and 28 countries were at that event. And part of the story we shared, along with the story that was shared by Vincent Martin from Detroit, Veronica Bidding from Winston-Salem, Dr. Velez, Carmen Velez from Puerto Rico, Vi from Alaska. We had a lot of people we invited to be a part of this. Margaret Gordon from California. So we brought in other partners where we had an opportunity to share on a large stage. We invited other communities who had similar issues like ours. We have traveled to their communities with our nickels and dimes, and they have traveled to our communities. So it's become a pretty significant network. And now we have a working group as a part of the National Citizen Science Association. And we have a meeting immediately after this presentation, virtual meeting.
Awesome. Well, that's really good to hear. And so now I'm going to go to a question from the audience. This one's for Lisa. So Lisa, has your research broached the topic of how does COVID-19 shelter-in-place orders expose or harm communities of color?
I was just typing a response to Crystal, so I just sent it. So no, so I need to write a bit more on this. So I've talked about it since COVID-19 and a number of presentations, including ones through the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice webinars on the relationship between climate impacts and COVID-19. So I do know in terms of socioeconomic issues, vulnerable communities in countries like India and also in the Caribbean, people need to leave their houses to work. Like people live on daily wages. And so it's had a negative economic impact on some communities. And I do know through the hurricane season, and Melissa, I don't know if you know what happened in Jamaica, but in the hurricane season in the Bahamas, at least, it was really tough to get people to move to shelters because they were really concerned about COVID-19. And even the people who plan for these disasters, the emergency management agencies, they are just so stretched because of COVID-19 to even sort of try to organize disaster preparedness for hurricanes. It was really difficult. It was a difficult season. So I did put a link there for a paper that I wrote for a great climate justice symposium held at Loyola Law Review, and they have a special edition on climate justice. And I wrote a paper with my colleague Adele Thomas on gender implications of climate-induced disasters, so looking at gender-based violence and what happens in disasters. And so it's like related to COVID-19, but basically, Crystal, I need to write more. So, thanks for the prompt.
Awesome. Okay, this next question is going to be for Melissa. So how do these gentrification projects violate EPA and civil rights laws of these communities? Were lawsuits filed to challenge them in Little Haiti?
So where lawsuits filed to challenge them, I'm not fully sure about that. That's something I would have to do more research on. But I'm pretty sure possibly not, because most of those areas are already being developed already by those developers.
Okay. So we'll go to one for a question from George Hayes. What are suggested sites or readings which organizations and communities can refer to as they begin the process of evaluating the impact and challenging local examples of environmental racism? So, we need to take a moment to direct the audience where they can start their activism and their education. So anyone can jump in on this.
Oh, well, the document link that I shared at the end of my presentation, the Goods Movement document, has been shared around quite a bit. I was on the work group to produce that document, and it specifically talked about the air quality issues that are emissions issues that creates the part of the climate issue around goods movement, the rail corridors, the airport corridors, the marine corridors, and the dry land port corridors and inland port corridors that I demonstrated is growing massively in our community. That document, if you look up EPA goods movement, then you probably will find it. Or goods movement, NEJAC, which is the initials, for, of course, for National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. It is quite thick. A lot of graphics, a lot of charts, a lot of photographs, a lot of detail about the recommendation we presented, specifically related to this issue. It wasn't couched in the term of climate, it was couched in the term of air quality and the impact of all these corridors and goods movement facilities being built on top of or right next to communities of color. And in the part of producing the document over a period of 3 years, I was required, along with a group of 24 people, to actually travel to these places to see them, actually, and smell them, which was not an enjoyable thing if you've never been in a port area where they're loading 24/7, the marine vessels in, the tractor trucks are in, the passenger cars are in, the SUVs are in, and you just can't breathe. Your nose is burning, your skin is itching. This is life 24/7 for people who live in these communities. That document will give you a tremendous amount of information.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll jump to another question. This one came in from Daniel. Does the movement toward renewable energy have any adverse effects on minority communities? I think that's a great question, because as we propose or envision solutions to the climate crisis, we need to make sure that it's not facilitating or creating new problems. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll start on this. So I've attended a lot of webinars on green energy and the green economy, and I think a really interesting webinar that I attended had a lot of renewable energy companies who, through the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer and the murder of George Floyd, sort of said, we had always thought that because we were a renewable energy company, we were like doing the right thing, right? I mean, we're doing the right thing and we're on the right side of history. And then they said, well, we looked around our organizations and realized that there's no people of color in them. And we realized we had this diversity problem. And so I think it's a similar issue as the one that Omega pointed out. So there need to be more diverse people working in these areas. The environmental NGO movement in particular has not been as diverse as it should be in the United States. And so there's a great research done on this called Green 2.0. And so people can look it up in terms of statistics. And so it's important that within these companies and policymakers are more diverse. And then, yeah, there's a problem. There's definitely a problem in terms of where renewable energy is sited, who has access to it, because a lot of them are sort of upfront costs. And so they're not always subsidized. And so there's definitely diversity and impacts on minority communities because of the green movement. And I think there has been some effort to ensure that the word used is just transitions. And so that the transition from fossil fuel to green energy is just and equitable. The term was used originally in relation to coal country and making sure that people had jobs, but I think it's been broadened now to ensure that Black and brown communities can benefit financially and also environmentally from the green movement. And so it's really important that the companies that are involved and the movements that are involved are diverse, and that communities that have historically been disadvantaged by fossil fuel development benefit from these new investments.
Yeah, just to add on that, Dano, I think one of the key realizations that American businesses of all stripes are realizing is that like our society kind of has a normalization of disposable people and disposable places as just like how business operates. And so as businesses are trying to create solutions, they have to become aware of problems that we previously didn't articulate as problems, where this would be a cost saving measure, or it was okay to move this group of people because this is how it's always been done. And I think the greater realization of how it's always been done hasn't been as positive as it's been relayed to all of us, is like the larger realization. As so even if we were focusing on renewable energy, the question is, so like, where are you going to put your plant? How's your plant going to be operated? All of these questions that you have to challenge the status quo to make sure that you're not inadvertently harming other communities that our society had structured that made it okay for you to perpetually harm them as you pursue profit. And so I think it's essentially like a larger discussion is just happening, and having people of color and these types of conversations make businesses more aware of the practices they can do. Because I think the tragic thing is like a lot of people are fully in the belief that they're doing the right thing because they're doing what came before them. And now it's, oh, wow, I'm realizing that the thing that came before me wasn't as good as I thought it was. And now I have to figure out what the right thing actually is. And that's a pretty profound problem, where you have to like reinvent what good is because you found out what you thought was good was actually bad. And so yeah, great question. And to go with it, follow up with this one, I think this question from Rachel, do any of the panelists find any value in restorative justice to repair harms of climate injustice for communities of color, as well as like a potential path forward? Open to any of you guys.
Well, I can respond. But first of all, I like to recognize, if you're seeing on the screen, at the bottom of the screen, another Omega Wilson, that is not another Omega Wilson. That's attorney Omori Wilson. He's our son. He put his link in the chat. So he does environmental work and preservation of properties and heirs properties and heritage properties for people in North Carolina. I think a lot of people are using the word reparations, and we looked at that. And when we get houses restored with block grants, and we get stormwater management included with block grants, when we get new highways put in communities that never had highways, we had streets in the city that had never been paved. We had outhouses for 30 years, 40, 50 years, with sewer running down other streets a block away where they couldn't connect to it. So if you call it restorative justice to get those connected without their having to pay for it because they've been paying taxes all their lifetime, we had to leverage legally to make the city do it for millions and millions of dollars. And right now we're investigating the city because half of the millions of dollars got missing. This is still one of those problems. When the funding stream goes into place to correct historic problems, very often the funds some kind of way kind of evaporate. This is federal monies, and governments can do it and local people cannot do it and get away with missing millions and millions of dollars. But all of this is restorative justice from our point of view. Some people like to call it reparations, repairing all these ills on the ground without the citizens who worked all our lives having to foot the bill in today's time. It has to be done with government and federal and tax money that people have already contributed to for generations and generations. Yes.
So I'll chime in real quick on the restorative justice. I think one of the complexities is with restorative, just the language of it. We're trying to restore something, and therefore there's an implication that it existed before. And I think the harsh realization with the U.S. in particular is that the justice that we're trying to restore is actually a new type of justice that America hasn't actually ever engaged in. And so if if there is an extractive ecosystem in our society where it's accustomed to extracting resources and funds from African Americans for the benefit of the white dominant society, if you inject a lot of funds into the Black community, those funds are going to then people are going to try to extract them for the benefit of somebody else and not for that community, because that's the nature of the society that has been created in America. So as America is trying to engage in some sort of restorative justice idea, which can be reparations, I think a key realization is that we're also in the process of creating a type of equality and equity that we've never had before. And if you look at, and America's attempted to do this before, if you look at the era of Reconstruction, that was a whole era where America was creating new policies and new ideas to promote equality in our country that had never existed before. And so there's a foundation for like bold ideas in creating equitable structures that take us forward and don't take us to like an imagined equitable past that we would be restoring. And so I think, we're kind of in that process, but to engage in that process, you have to realize that the equality that we're hoping for is like one that we kind of are tasked with making now and not referring to like idyllic past that we can like use as a template.
Yeah, and I think I would just add, I mean, Omega's been in this fight for a long time. I think issues of environmental justice have really not been prioritized by agencies like the EPA for many, many decades, even though there have been a lot of policies around it. There's not been implementation of those. But I think the new executive orders on climate and also the executive order on towards racial equity, I think it's called, and I think those will go up on the links. They acknowledge the issue at least, and they do talk about just transitions to ensure that Black and Brown communities benefit financially from investments in renewable energy. And I think that's really important. And a lot of environmental justice advocates have been talking about this for a long time. So at least it's now acknowledged that this is an issue, and hopefully can be further implemented through at least federal policies going forward.
Perfect.
And hopefully by the private sector as well,
Yes, definitely by the private sector, because the private sector in America have been interwoven as if they're the same thing from day one. And I think that's also something we don't really think about. Where like Jamestown, our first successful colony, was like a corporate venture funded by the British. So like that was just a company.
Yeah, no, I think Omega's presentation is really good at looking at sort of the corporate interests involved at the same time as, they are promoting, environmental social governance issues on their websites and putting Black Lives Matter, on their Twitter. I mean, and then you can see the operations on the ground of which they're actually doing for profit. So
yeah,
it's a disconnect.
it's a very disconnected and a myopic way of looking at things, where like if I do a bad thing first and follow it up with a good thing, then it balances out. And it's like, well, if the bad thing funds the good thing, clearly that's not going to balance anything out. You're just at scale going to have a net negative. And that's just something we really need to realize. And that net negative is, in the US, it's always been dependent on racial division and the exploitation of the other. And so yeah, that's how it is. But yeah, so I think I think we're coming to a close here. So if anybody else has any extra questions, I actually, let's go to I'll look at Elaine real quick. I think she had a good point on this question about having diversity within an organization as a start, but to have a voice and an impact will possibly move an organization. And I think it's a really good point. And I think a key thing is when you have the voices in the organization, that they say the necessary things. I think it's very easy for organization to have people of color and say, hey, look at how diverse we are. But if the people of color have to say the exact same thing as the people who aren't of color, then are we making the progress that we envision? So maybe to close it out, what are what perspectives or statements do you think like people of color in these positions need to champion regarding like racial equality, environmental justice, to make sure that we make the progress that we need to make? Because I'm sure there's a lot of them listening in right here, and we can start making the change now. So
I want to make a slightly contrary point to this. As someone who's been working in climate justice issues and been very aware of racial issues in my life and in my work, it's exhausting. So from a professional perspective, and people of color have been in this movement for so many years, up against brick walls for so many years, it's not just our job to do this. It's, white people have to be allies and raise these issues as well. Like, the onus is not just on us, because it's too much for only us to be involved in this. So everybody has to play their part. Everybody has to learn and find resources and educate themselves. And that was a huge part of the Black Lives Movement this summer, right? To say that, do your homework and, go out and find out about these issues. And then we all have to be advocates within, government organizations and within boards of companies and private entities. Like, this is work that everybody has to do, because these levels of inequality affect everybody. And I also want to make this last point. People, and that's why I'm so cautious about images. People assume that climate change just affects people of color. It disproportionately affects people of color, but it affects white people too. And we've seen that across the United States. And so we are all in this fight, and we all need to be making these points together, because I think it's too much to put the burden on people of color all the time. And if you are a person of color in a predominantly white space, it's really difficult. You're under a lot of pressure, and it can be difficult. So I think my plug is we all need to do this together.
I think that's a perfect way to summarize it. It strangely reminded me of when I was a kid, and there would always be Black History Month, which is the month we're in. And there'd be that moment in class where everyone would look at me and be like, explain Black history, Barrett. and after class, me and like other African Americans in school, we would talk about how frustrating it was. And I would look at my friends and say, but these white people in Marietta don't know anything about Black people. They're not actually being bad people. We just live in a very segregated place, and they don't know anything. So it's part of my job to tell them stuff, even though I think it's ridiculous that I might have to tell them. It's my job to tell them stuff so that they know things. And then the year after that, or the year after that, they're not looking at me because they already get it. And that's really a key component of being Black in society, is we get into these spaces, and the goal is not just for us to always have the onus to explain it over and over and over again, because that is exhausting, but to explain it in a way so that we can have allies and foster community with people. Because as you said, these problems disproportionately impact people of color, but they impact everybody. And we need to be in it together so that we can make the progress that we need to make. And so with that, I think I'll bring it to a close. If anyone has anything else they'd like to add, feel free, but I've really enjoyed this panel. I hope the audience had a great time, and this has been a great time. Oh, I have closing language I need to say. So thank you for joining us for this free webinar. We'd also like to express our gratitude to this esteemed group of panelists. You are all doing such critical work, and we thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to do this. The section of Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope this helps you in your work. And again, if you can please consider joining and becoming active in the ABA. You may also do that at ambar.org/CRSJ, and you can find information on other free programs on the CRSJ webpage. And also, we've recorded all of this, so I believe attendees will get an email sent to them of this recording, and it will be available on YouTube. So everyone have a great day, and this